Hello and welcome to the Discover History YouTube channel, and today we're taking a look at another firearm that was around and used during the English Civil War. An interesting fact, this week actually is the anniversary of the Battle of Powick Bridge. It was fought on the 23rd of September 1642. It's basically where the English Civil War began. Now, last month we actually took a look at the matchlock musket, and obviously that was known as the matchlock because it used a length of match. However, today what we're going to take a look at is something known as a carbine, and that's quite important, especially in regard to the Battle of Powick Bridge, purely because it was a cavalry weapon. It's a firearm used by the cavalry. In general, a cavalry trooper would carry a sword, riding on a horse, which is actually a weapon in its own right, carrying a pair of pistols, a brace of pistols, and sometimes a carbine. Now, the carbines seem to have been used more by the royalist forces during the Civil War than the Parliament forces. However, right at the end of the English Civil War, it was said that Parliament was starting to use more and more carbines as well. So it's quite an interesting fact. These firearms were used mainly in the royalist army, and it was a secondary weapon after they've used their swords and pistols, for example. Now, not every cavalry trooper carried one, and in our favourite book, Arms and Armour of the English Civil War, you will actually see pictures of original carbines just of there. So we have two on this page, as you can see, and the locking mechanism is actually a little bit more complicated, and they were always slung or hanged on a strap. Now, as always, we like to have the real thing. The main reason for that is so we can demonstrate the firing of them, but more importantly, so people, when we do a talk or when we go into a school, can actually pick these things up and actually see them. And as we always say, our replicas are based on original ones, and the carbine that I'm going to show you now is based on a tower one, just like our matchlock that we showed you last week. So this is a carbine, and luckily for Ian, this is actually much shorter, obviously, than the matchlock musket, because this isn't a musket, it's a carbine, and a carbine is purely a cavalry weapon. Now, it has pretty much the same characteristics as the matchlock. So you've got the lock, which obviously is a little bit more complicated than the matchlock mechanism. There's actually more to go wrong with this, but it works better in bad weather, windy conditions, pouring rain, that sort of thing. So you've got the lock, you've got a very short stock, and then obviously you have the barrel on the top. A few other bits and pieces to look out for. Obviously, it's got the scouring stick, because all these weapons are muzzle loading, so you have to ram down the charge. And when you have a look at the locking mechanism, it has the lock itself, or the what would be the serpent on a matchlock. There is also a dog lock, and this is a very important safety device on these. You have a frizzen, and inside the clamp here, inside a bit of leather, you actually have the flint. And obviously this is a very expensive piece of equipment, really. As I mentioned, matchlocks can cost anything to about 10 shilling, whereas these are up to about 14 shilling. They're more expensive things, and like I said, more complicated. Things can go wrong with them. You also have a long bar on this side, and that's for attaching the sling, because as I mentioned, it comes with a sling. So here we have a replica of that sling. So it comes with an iron buckle. Not all of them do, but that allows it to be adjusted, which is more useful. And then a very simple spring that is used for clipping it. And these are usually worn from the left shoulder to the right hand side. And remember, these are not always carried, and when they are carried, they are dropped to the side, literally against the saddle of the horse. And when required, they can be swung up, they can be fired from the shoulder. So if you can imagine, I'm holding the reins with my left hand, I can fire the thing in the shoulder, or if need be, it can be fired from the hip directly into another cavalry trooper, or maybe even into a foot soldier or something like that. Now, to load and fire them, they're a little bit more complicated, and what usually got attached to the saddle of the horse was some equipment for the loading and firing of it. So here we have a strap that can be tied directly to the saddlery of the horse. It has a shot bag containing all the shot that you require to fire the thing. It also has this triangular powder flask with a spring at the top, which allows it to be opened and closed. And unfortunately, there's no measure on it, so you have to guess the amount of powder that you're putting in. We also have a small oil bottle, identical to the ones on the bandolier. And then a new piece of equipment is this. And this is very important. You've got the pricker on the one end for unblocking the vent. And then these things that look like screwdrivers are used to adjust the flint. So it's quite an important thing, really. Without it, when the flint starts to get worn down, you will really struggle getting a spark. So how were they loaded? Now, they were usually loaded before the battle, because loading any firearm on a horse is very difficult, especially if you can imagine you're trotting or galloping in the attack. So it'd be almost impossible to reload these. So they were reloaded or loaded before the fight started. First of all, you need to pull back the lock at this end, and you have to engage the dog lock, and this is very clever. So you pull the lock back and engage that dog lock. Now that dog lock enables you to pull the trigger without the worry of it going off by accident. So it's a very important thing. The dog lock, very simple, but very important safety device. We then take our powder flask, this piece of wood and metal, this triangle, and we sprinkle powder inside the priming pan, almost identical to the matchlock. The only difference is, instead of a sliding plate, this has the frizzen, which is important because the flint has to hit that frizzen and the two slap together, creating the spark that ignites the powder. Much more efficient in bad weather, works even in windy conditions. I've used this in wet and windy conditions and it's worked each time. But like I said, more can go wrong. It's very complicated inside there. A lot of springs can go wrong, a lot of bits can fall off it, and if you swing this around at people, hitting them on the head, as you would do with a matchlock, you can actually damage this weapon, especially the lock. It's very complicated and very susceptible to damage. It was then turned around, and this is where the cavalry trooper has to guess the amount of powder that's going in, and this is all down to skill at the end of the day. And then once he's done that, he takes a lead shot, some wadding, especially as the fact that it's going to be slung and bouncing around on the horse. Doesn't want it emptying the powder and shot all over the place. You then take the scouring stick, also made out of wood, and everything's packed down inside the barrel. That has to be taken out, and as you can see, it is very hard to do if you're bouncing up and down on a horse, and that is then ready to go. And that would literally sit on the saddle, or on the strap I should say, bouncing around as the cavalry troopers go into battle. When they're ready to fire it, they will then pull the lock back fully. There we go, and naturally the dog lock falls off. It automatically drops away. Now if you are lucky, and I can't always guarantee this, hopefully I've adjusted the flint enough, hopefully it's not too dark, you should be able to see the spark. Possibly not. And this is a problem sometimes with the flint. The flint has to be in a good position for it to spark, and this weapon, I can tell you now, hasn't been fired for a long period of time. There we go, got a spark that time. And obviously that spark will land inside the pan. That ignites the charge runs through the vent as it does with a matchlock, and this thing fires off. Very rarely would these be reloaded on horseback, because obviously it's a bit more difficult to do. But if you have a look through the playlist and have a look at the time when I got my wargame figures out, you will see the tactics that I've put in there. The old tactic, the ancient tactics that go right back really to the 16th century or the late medieval, was to ride in lines, firing off pistols, firing off the carbines, and then withdrawing to the rear and reloading, and then going forward again. But like I said, as the Civil War developed, the tactic was to fire the pistols, fire any carbines, and then draw the sword and finish the enemy off with the sword. So as you can see, these are generally one-shot weapons. Now it's interesting to note also that the carbine became very useful for patrolling, and if you look at for example the Battle of Powick Bridge that was fought in 1642, it was an accidental fight really. Two bodies of cavalry bumped into each other. Luckily they did have their firearms as well as their swords, and the skirmish over at Powick was all over in about 15 minutes. So you've seen our matchlock, 17th century matchlock, and we've just showed you a 17th century carbine as used by the cavalry. Now this is as much your site as it is ours, so remember, even though we're not doing daily videos now, that was purely during the COVID-19 lockdown, if you would like us to do any videos on any topic, military or even social history, please let us know, and what we'll do, we'll slot them in. We'll try and do one at least once a month or every couple of months, but let us know what you would like us to see. We do like to tie things in to anniversaries, as we do with this one this month, the Battle of Powick. Anyway, on that note, stay safe and we'll see you soon. Bye bye.